Welcome to Association Chat, your online discussion where we warm ourselves by the virtual fire with topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the community. I'm the host of Association Chat, KiKi L'Italien, and could AI revolutionize student success? Could it foster inclusivity? Could it bridge gaps in educational equity? We hear a lot about plagiarism. We hear a lot about the scary stuff, but what about the good stuff? Is it possible that AI could be our friend? Let's talk about it. I have some special guests with me here today to help answer some of these questions. And so, helping me to answer that question, Charles Ansell, Michael Baston, and we have Audrey Ellis with us here today. Hi, welcome everyone.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thank you for being here. I want to dive right into it so that we have a chance to get into this discussion. You know, AI, it's everywhere. You can't avoid it in the news and the headlines. And one place where you start to hear about complications almost exclusively is in higher ed. People are talking about not trusting the work that's being done. They're really dwelling on that in the conversations that I'm a party to on a regular basis. But I think what's really interesting is that the work that you all have been doing together is looking at how it might actually be something that is a positive. And I thought, let's explore it. So I'm going to start with you, Charles, if you don't mind. I want to ask you about how you see generative AI impacting policy and advocacy in higher ed, especially in terms of equity and completion rates.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'll try to be brief, but it's actually really hard because there's a real lot to unpack there. Because I think that very often when we think about AI, we think immediately, oh, wow, this is such a powerful new way that we can do business and get work done. But unless we really think problem first about what this sort of technology is supposed to solve, we're never going to use it, right? And so, in that question, how are we going to use AI to help with policy and advocacy, particularly for student success and for equitable outcomes in post-secondary? I think that we need to zoom back a little bit, right? We have to start with the acknowledgement of where higher education is at, where the sector is at in terms of equity and in terms of completion rates. And then what are the policy and advocacy levers that we're supposed to, use to ameliorate the situation? And really only then, how can generative AI help? At least that's how we see it at Complete College America. So just really quick running that through. Higher ed, in my opinion, is not really in a great place, right? And I don't think a lot of people really know this outside of the sector. And it does indeed need transformation. So we can start with some basic facts, right? So for full-time students attending public four-year colleges and universities, the number of full-time students who graduate in 4 years from four-year colleges is 40%. And that's a number that's buoyed by well-resourced public flagship universities. For two-year colleges, the two-year graduation rate for full-time students is about 18%. So that's less than 1 in 5, and it's roughly the same for part-time students at community colleges who graduate in 6 years. So these numbers are lower for students who come from less resourced communities, for students of color, and it's especially true because colleges, it's a struggle to work with working learners the most. Students who work more than 20 hours per week rarely graduate, and when they do, they get saddled with debt. So the students who do go to college, the students who most need to be the beneficiaries of that transformative social mobility that college can offer, these are the students who are most likely not to graduate in the way the current system is set up. So this is happening, of course, at a time when a college degree has never had a higher premium. So not only do most jobs require a degree, but almost all good careers do. And by 2031, Georgetown estimates, I want to say it's 72%, or about 3 in 4 U.S. residents need to have a post-secondary credential of some sort to meet our workforce needs optimally. And yet in the last few decades, what we've set up is, a financial system where the Pell Grant only has a third of its original purchasing power, and tuition and student loan debt has skyrocketed. So in other words,
oh my gosh, hold up. Hold up. Like just saying that, I think, Oh my gosh, I had no idea. First of all, I had no idea that that was the case, but that's scary. That's really, I mean, that's something that people really rely on to be able to go and just, sorry, I was just
Yeah.
distracted by that was a pretty crazy statistic added to all the other.
Well, and yeah, and I think that the big problem, right, is, I mean, that's a problem in itself, but at the same time, we're also putting forward this message that's very accurate and true, that higher education, you need a credential now more than ever. So the only thing worse than being able to um, struggle to afford it while attending, which is something that, causes student attrition in a very large amount. But the only thing worse is being shut out of the economy because you don't have the degree or the certificate to be able to participate in the first place. And so, like, this is where we get to those policy and advocacy levers for equitable student success. And I know this is a long wind up, but I am going to bring it to AI. But I think you can boil that down to three things, right? I think first, we need to get out of our own way. We need to get rid of bad practices and bureaucracy that prevent students from having purpose in their majors, structure to their academic experience, momentum to timely completion, and really having enough support to complete college on time. And we'll hear from a college president who's doing exactly those things. Second, we need targeted interventions to support students equitably. So not every student needs the same thing, right? Like, that's the whole premise. Some students may need relatively shallow support, some deep, some need different individualized attention depending on what their needs are. And then the third is, we can't just efficiency our way out of this, right? There's been a lot of studies that have gone on in high schools to show that you add a lot of high touch interventions in a under resourced school, you can see incremental gains in high school completion rates, but it's never going to be as strong as at well resourced high schools. It's the same thing in colleges. Student success interventions can create incremental change. We've seen it in the last decade in the college completion movement, but we'll hit a ceiling soon, and we have to fund higher education like we care about it. And so that's where generative AI comes in, not just on that funding piece, of course, but essentially on those three areas, right? So, like, first, we have to have a stance towards generative AI as something that is a power for good, not just a power for plagiarism. Like, to your point about all the controversy in AI around higher education, it's been so much of the attention has been on this negative side of things, but we have to dive headlong into its promises. The second is that we have to use it to solve the problems that we see in student success. Talking about having equitable interventions, the need to innovate in schedules and credit for prior learning for part-time students, the need to get all students on semester by semester academic plans, and really liberate advising functions, where counselors meet with students. So much of that is manual transactional conversations on, like, well, what course at what time? And there's not enough time to have those rich conversations where advisors are able to give actual advice. And finally, and I would say most importantly, we need to make sure generative AI isn't the sole purview of rich colleges, right? The MITs, the Stanfords, the Penns, the colleges whose presidents are important enough to get yelled at by Congress. We need to make sure that community colleges, rural colleges, HBCUs, PBIs, and other minority serving institutions aren't working off hardware infrastructure routers and switches from the 90s that are woefully inadequate to the horsepower required to optimize generative AI for student success. So, I know that was a bit of a long answer, but I think it's good to, like, at the outset, just talk about the problems that we're trying to solve, because that's the only way we switch our orientation on generative AI.
I mean, I think it was the perfect setup because I think, you provided a really great background and foundation for why we're having this conversation in the first place. So thank you for doing that. You talked about the promise of AI and the problems with success for many students, why they can't be successful or find success in higher ed, and then not leaving all of this to the rich colleges that can afford to be left alone when they're experimenting and trying some new things. Experiment sounds scary. Let's say trying new things. I want to actually bring this over to someone who probably has a very interesting perspective to share on it as well. And so let's talking to you, President Michael Baston. Let's talk about this, about from the perspectives of a community college president. What are the practical challenges and opportunities of integrating AI into the curriculum? What are the challenges that you're seeing?
Well, first and foremost is to desensitize the faculty who have to invigorate and integrate AI into the curriculum. Because, as Charles mentioned, the idea that some think about plagiarism and that sort of becomes the color by which they look at the conversation. But the fact is, AI is not going anywhere. The fact is, students will actually have access to the technology. And so it is not feasible to just simply say, well, we're going to put in our syllabus, you can't use any AI, because they're going to use Grammarly, which is AI. They're going to use all of the other kinds of technology and tools that are going to be helpful, and that actually the faculty do want them to actually have that support. So I think it's important for educational institutions to resource and provide professional development for faculty so that they can best integrate the opportunities with AI. And particularly at the community college, when we focus heavily on thinking about the career exploration of our students and the kinds of career aspirations that they have, thinking about preparing those students to go into the world of work for those who will go right into it. You want them to be prepared for the expectations of employers who, when they get in the workplace, are going to expect them to work smarter and not harder, to be producing at a higher level. And so, even the basic premise of generative AI, the prompt, the ability to get students to understand prompt characteristics and how to use that effectively, will actually separate those in the workplace who don't have that orientation and background and skill set. And so, we do a disservice to our students if we are not arming them with everything they need to effectively navigate the realities of a changing landscape, whether it's in education or in the world of work. And also, listen, we have Turnitin. So you can get your students to actually look at, the content of Turnitin tells you not only about plagiarism, but it also tells you about AI-generated content. So it is not that faculty members are completely devoid of any kind of ways to ensure originality and authenticity of student work. It is to show students, use this for inspiration, use this for feedback, use this to help you sort of, I can't be with you 24/7. You're at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're doing your essay. I can't be there with you to do that essay. But you can use this technology to help you spark ideas. But at the end of the day, you're going to get credit for your originality. You're going to get credit for your authenticity. And we shouldn't act like they're not going to have access to what they already have access to.
Right. I mean, I remember this back when we started looking at things like social media and in the workforce, what we saw was this desire to control by pretending that if we suppressed this, if we said this technology is not allowed to be used in the area, what happened? Everybody's over here doing that, like you couldn't suppress it. You couldn't outlaw it. And when you're talking about something like generative AI, I think the challenge is that, to your point, people are focusing on weaponizing it in a way that it can be used for things like creating malicious code or breaking the rules by like plagiarizing and things like that. But you could also be weaponizing it on the other side by not allowing people to learn how to effectively use it in day-to-day life when it's such an effective tool. So,
KiKi,
yeah.
can I just add something on that point?
Yeah.
I think, what seems particularly crazy to me, the social media thing is a really good point. There's I forget, there's a random philosopher, it's not random, I just don't know the person's name, but I heard it on another podcast, who said, when you invent electricity, you invent electrocution. When you invent, anything good, you invent the bad thing too. And sometimes we don't acknowledge that we invent the bad thing. And in this case, I think it's the opposite. It's like we just ran to, oh no, we invented electrocution without even bothering to see what sort of power we had in our hands that we could harness. And I think, to President Baston's point, I think it's very telling that certain things that, students with way more resources have been able to do forever, like pay people to write essays for them. Now that everybody can do it and it's democratized, oh no, now it's bad. And I think that's a big tell on what our priorities are.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really, I mean, it's a great segue into the next question that I had, because I wanted to reach over to Audrey and give Audrey a chance to speak to this great playbook, the work that you've been doing. You've been thinking about this quite a bit. You've been thinking about this topic and the issue at hand, which is, you know, what are we doing to actually take the power of some of this generative AI and some of the advancements in AI to use it for good, right? And how can we allow higher ed to actually, you know, make use of this in a better way? So you have a playbook. You outline in this playbook, you outline strategies for leveraging AI to increase college completion and equity. And so I would love if you could just elaborate on one or two of the key strategies that would be particularly relevant for association professionals who are listening to this now, or maybe they're listening to it later, for them to pay attention to on this.
Sure. And it is a fun thing to think about, right? To treat every problem as an opportunity. And so we really did try to take that mindset and kind of flip the problem on its head while we were working on building out this playbook. So grateful for Charles and Complete College America, who really gave us the platform to facilitate this discussion, which was built by so many thought leaders in the higher ed space. And so I'm going to go a little bit more broad in terms of the practices or strategies that I suggest, because we're still in the early stages. And I don't think it makes a lot of sense to get too tactical right now. But kind of building off of Charles and President Baston's points, the first suggestion that I have is to think about how you can create learning opportunities for your higher education partners in whatever industry you're in. I know that today we're speaking to industries really from across the workforce. And so someone actually I saw from Facebook said higher ed should partner more with industry partners. And I couldn't agree more. And I think that's what's so exciting about this podcast. I spoke with a college provost recently who was working with their welding corporate partner to go learn all about how they are using AI in their welding work right now, and to then revamp all of their curriculum to have AI embedded so that they're preparing their welding students to graduate and with those competencies instead of having to get them out in the field. And as much as higher ed is a source of learning and knowledge, we're on campus, right? Like we're working and doing research and working with our students. And community colleges especially are a really amazing intersection of the workforce space and the campus environment. And with such a rapidly changing technology, we can't possibly know exactly how it's impacting your industry unless the lines of communication are wide open. And I think that because this is also a cost prohibitive technology right now, there's a lot of upfront costs with building your own AI infrastructure, getting your data even ready to the point where you could do that. The other, I guess this is kind of a sub strategy one recommendation, would be to work with your industry or your higher education partners to support them in their learning, even if that looks financial, because it's an investment in your future workforce to ensure that they're at an institution that is preparing them for the expectations you're going to have for your future employees. And the second piece that I'll touch on is around thinking about things in phases. We kind of talked about this, and Charles has a really interesting analogy, electrocution and electricity. But we do tend to think of the ends of the spectrum, right? Like what's the most AI futuristic vision possible and what's right now? But there really, in my mind, are kind of three steps that we need to be thinking about, which might look different for every institution, depending on if you're an association or if you're an institution of higher education, which is right now, the middle term, and the future. And I think that we can't miss that middle term because we're in this process of building towards that potential future moment. And if we're not kind of planning and thinking about all of those stages, we're going to do ourselves a disservice when we get to that middle stage. We also need to be thinking really creatively and big picture, like Charles suggested, around what is the ultimate problem we're trying to solve, not just how can we efficiency ourselves out of this situation in this exact moment. So keeping all three of those time frames as top of mind, I think applies to every industry right now, because AI is such a ubiquitous tool that can apply to really any element of our lives.
Yeah, we had a comment from someone who is watching live who said, "Remember when electronic calculators weren't allowed in the classroom?" I do. I do actually. And,
Me too.
we laugh about it now, but it definitely, it wasn't that long ago, relatively speaking. And, it does feel like that where when you have these tools, why wouldn't you figure out how to use them? And almost it's a hindrance if you don't teach how to use them accurately and in the best possible way to help people to do what they need to do better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and if I could just add one piece to that, I think that AI, the calculator is a really convenient analogy or kind of mental reference point. I've heard some interesting pushback on that because AI is applicable to so much more than just math, which of course is not just math. But I think that we need to really not just teach people how to use AI, but also how to decide if AI is necessary to use. And you can't really make that
Mm-hmm.
distinction if you've never used it. So that's why we need it might be good to learn your times tables, memorize your multiplication figures without a calculator. But if you know that there's this thing out there that you've never been allowed to try, you might be very tempted. Instead, we should be, I think, convincing people and giving them that kind of ability to judge for themselves when it's appropriate to use and when it isn't.
That's a great point because my daughter's getting ready to learn how to drive and she doesn't know life without GPS existing. But we also know that sometimes it doesn't always work. And so, doesn't she need to know how to use an atlas if she needs to, right? So, these are things that I think it's a really good point. When should we use it? When shouldn't we? And that actually is a thank you very much, Audrey, leading me into my next question, which has to do with some of the ethical considerations when we're thinking about, and specifically thinking about associations in this case, but it really could be any organization. When you're thinking about enhancing engagement, enhancing learning, what are the ethical considerations that you should be mindful of? So this is an open question. I don't know if Michael, if you would like to answer it, or Charles or Audrey, but it's open to anyone who feels particularly passionate in their answer.
Well, clearly, recognizing the importance of due diligence is critical. From my perspective, you ultimately have to understand that people who put the information in the algorithms may not necessarily have cultural sensitivities. You may not have accurate information. And so there's a certain amount of expectation that whoever's going to use the AI, that there is going to be a need to engage in the level of due diligence. Because quite frankly, when we don't use this work and we don't see it as a tool, and we think that it is a solution and not a tool, then we ultimately could be spreading false information. We could be, actually perpetrating a lot of frauds out there with the information. So it's very important from the ethical perspective that you, as a person who's going to utilize the AI, that you actually do your due diligence. So that you're not kind of spreading out misinformation and bad information, quite frankly.
Well, so, Charles, were you about to say something?
Well, I was actually gonna, I hope Audrey doesn't mind, but I think of, your story, and I think you should be the one to share it, the one that the Boston Globe picked up on, where, it really like, if you think of this example and what it could do in the classroom or for policymakers, if AI hallucinates these answers and incorporates these biases, I think it's emblematic of the real dangers, but I don't want to tell Audrey's story for her. So
No.
Sure. I think it's a pretty funny story, and it is like a kind of low stakes way to illustrate how wrong these situations can end up. So, backstory, I am on my last year of playing fantasy football. I don't have time for it anymore, but I was on my husband's league for about 8 years. We played on Yahoo Fantasy. And my team name, because I was the only female on the whole league, was Play Like a Girl, which is a few years old by now, but it was like the Nike slogan for women's soccer. And I loved that and thought, why not? So I did terribly this year, which is another reason. For the record, I have won before, but this year was not my year. And I kind of just gave up. And I got a season recap that was ChatGPT generated by Yahoo. And ChatGPT really just took my team name, Play Like a Girl, and the fact that I lost and ran with it. So this summary was absolutely full of suggestions that, like a girl, I lost and had a terrible season. And like a girl, I don't know anything about football. And it was honestly, I think, Charles, you're misremembering. The Boston Globe did not pick the story up, but I did submit, feedback to Yahoo. And I think that, as funny as it is, and generally people are playing fantasy football as a hobby and hopefully not in many professional contexts, but people can put kind of all kinds of things in their team names and in their smack talk and all of that. And the fact that all of that was potentially informing this use case for an AI bot unchecked is a pretty risky application so early in the time of generative AI. So hopefully they learned their lesson, but hopefully it also brought some laughs.
Oh my gosh, that sounds like it could have been a nightmare. It is such a great example though, Charles. I'm so glad you brought it up, because you could easily see where that could have gone really, really, really terribly wrong if that had been at a larger scale. So, excellent example. Well, I was wondering about, for associations, there's an association for everything, as we like to say. And so certainly there's always this concern about where can things go wrong and how can we mitigate risk. I'm sure in higher ed, you're very familiar with this concern about mitigating risk. Are there ways for associations to advocate for or against certain uses of AI in education to ensure that it benefits a diverse student body? Because we have associations that are looking for its members, that are going into its industries, starting all the way back, going through school, very concerned about making sure that this science or this industry is receiving the type of education and protection and concern that it needs to have. And certainly with a new technology or something that's advancing so quickly, there's a lot of concern about, like, well, how do we make sure it benefits our people, our students, the ones that are coming into our field?
I can start on that. I think that there's two things that come to mind for me when you say that, KiKi. So one is, I think it's, important to also just use our discussion as a sort of like analogy or model or whatever word you want to use for your own association, what you're trying to represent for your members, because the problems that we're grappling with in higher education port to, real estate, they port to healthcare. Are you being, problem first in terms of what this technology can do? And then are you taking a comprehensive look on all the issues that your association is grappling with? Are you tracking those issues in a mutually exclusive manner such that you know exactly where AI could plug in, or any technology for that matter, and what the limitations are? If you just don't do that in that way, it's going to be, I think, a lost cause. The second piece is really getting directly at your question, which is, how can associations interact with higher education on this? I'm curious what others here, Audrey, President Baston, think about this. But I think that we need to find a way to very quickly get AI learning outcomes into the heads of all of our students in all disciplines, because what I fear is going to happen is that a lot of social mobility ladders that exist to really good paying jobs, like really strong careers, like thinking like major accounting firms, major law firms, major consultancies, lots of these things start at the associate level. And we're beginning to see the inklings that a lot of those jobs that start these career ladders could go away because AI can sweep these knowledge bases and do these things that end up informing, the lawyers and the consultants and the, engagement managers. And yet, if we the way that higher ed works, it's kind of slow, right? Like we have to, to get new programs approved and all this, you have to go through this accreditation process, and sometimes these are multi-year things. And so I think there's players in the field of post-secondary that associations, and I think Complete College America is one of them, and I encourage folks to, if they want to reach out after this, maybe they could have my contact info. But that can look at ways to make sure that at the course by course level and at the certificate level, that these competencies, as the field is just starting, that they get swept in right away. So then that way, students are ready in their existing programs of study. So we don't need to wait the several years that higher ed always takes to catch up to these things, if that makes sense. I think for people who are not in higher ed, so often we think of the 7% of colleges that are selective enrollment that get hauled in front of the Senate to get yelled at and stuff, because that's where like most of the media went to college. But like 93% of students are at, non-selective colleges, and most of them are under resourced, and lots of them, through no fault of their own, have to move a little slower than they could otherwise. And so we need to find ways to fund that, but also disrupt it, so that way students are ready, not just in terms of the AI that is used to deliver higher education, which has been our discussion so far, but also being a successful alum, which is the point of higher ed, is including being very competent in AI in the existing programs.
I mean, well said. And actually, I want to give a shout out to a friend of ours in the association space, 6 Degrees of Associations. It says, love this discussion. So many aha moments in this one. And I have to say, first of all, check out their podcast too. Also, can't help but agree. I mean, I think that there are a lot of aha moments I've certainly heard in this one. And Charles, when you were talking about it, I was thinking, absolutely, associations are always thinking about like, what's the future for the industry? What's the future for our members? How do we best prepare them? Like higher ed is also thinking about this. And when you want to talk about some really great partnerships, higher ed and the associations that are working to represent some of those industries that we're all concerned about, the students that are going through, the individuals who are going through, and then forming the workforce and really the society that's around us. So that all leads me to this next question that has to do with, what are some examples where it's already beginning to work, where we're starting to see, okay, we're using AI in a meaningful way that is successful. That's something that we would look at and we would say, okay, AI, here we have you in this higher educational setting. What lessons can we learn from some of the early success stories that we're hearing?
I mean, we do have faculty right now who are fully engaged in piloting a number of innovative utilizations of AI. So I think that, while there might be this suggestion that higher education writ large is sort of concerned about and don't want to get involved in AI, that's not the case everywhere. There are a lot of places that recognize that we can't unilaterally disarm opportunity for students. The fact is, if we want graduates who are going to effectively navigate the workplace environment, and this technology is now an expectation in that environment, if we don't look at our learning objectives and now reassess them and actually invigorate our syllabi in ways that allow them to develop the skill sets, they're not going to be as successful, and we're not going to be as effective in the work that we do. So there are a lot of folks all around the country who are in higher education spaces that are already starting to really examine this work. You look at Maricopa, that system actually has degrees now in AI, brand new degrees. So while it often takes a long time for some in higher ed to move, not in a non-degree space, you can run certificate programs pretty flexibly. You can build those as stackable credentials into existing programs. So it's not that we are completely handcuffed from being innovative. What we have to do is understand the importance of balancing AI with really the human interaction, because AI is not going to replace all of the humans. But we've got to learn how to best integrate the efforts together.
Right. That balanced approach, I think, is it's full of nuances. And as with anything that has nuances, it's very difficult when something's not black or white, it's very difficult to know what the right thing is and the best way to navigate it. But we have to figure out the best way forward. Audrey, do you have examples? What are you hearing? I know you're pulling together stories and talking with everyone.
Yeah, we are creating a council on equitable AI, or we have created, and we're meeting later this week in person for the first time, which is really exciting. And so we hope that that will really help us kind of gather and collect these practices, because I couldn't agree more, President Baston, that this is happening in incredible scope and scale. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing is that it's happening in a really decentralized way, which is not bad for innovation, don't get me wrong, but makes it really hard to learn from what others are doing and replicate without starting from scratch in every pocket. And so you have institutions that are maybe have some pockets of enthusiasm and some pockets of terror, however you want to call it, whatever you want to call it. And then you have institutions themselves, where you have some institutions that are just totally on board and some that are not. So I think that is, it's really interesting, because there's a lot of great examples of AI broadly, right? And how it's been used in AI in higher education. Georgia State University has done a lot of retention work for years and kind of initially started a lot of that focus. Recently, John Jay partnered with a startup that was, a nonprofit startup to figure out how to increase their retention. But these are not older, but less kind of groundbreaking types of AI, because AI is a wide swath of technology. What we're really interested right now, and everyone is generative AI, chat GPT, things like that, and how that can then inform everything else, even other types of AI. And that's where I think we still haven't really been able to put a pin on exactly what institutions are doing necessarily, or anything beyond pilots, because there hasn't been enough time. We need to see how this goes, but we also can't wait necessarily until they're done, or until the academic peer review process finalizes, so that a journal article can get published to talk about it, because I can guarantee that other institutions are thinking about it or attempting it themselves, and would benefit greatly from hearing kind of more intermediate updates on how things are going. So that's why we're really trying to facilitate that more rapid lesson sharing practices through the playbook, through the council, so that we're not, hurry up then wait type of timeline and process, because AI is not waiting. It is just like full speed ahead, whether or not we get on its timeline.
Well,
Can I add one thing to what Audrey just said? I think, in terms of the use cases, just thinking about the associations in the audience, I think that it's important to take a look at the playbook that I believe was shared, around or could be shared in the chat, that Audrey's referring to, because even though it's higher ed specific, I think it's organized into things that all organizations end up benefiting from, right? Like we split it by teaching and learning and student success and organizational effectiveness, and data. And sure, some of these won't be one-to-one, right? Especially like the teaching and learning section. Although most companies have professional development, right? Most companies have a knowledge base. And I think that the big thing to get those use cases going at such an embryonic stage for the industry is to get these sample prompts into more and more hands. And so whether it's porting these over yourself, or even asking a generative AI to do that work for you, how can this document work for my industry? I think that'd be a very worthwhile task and could save hundreds of hours of time.
I mean, it really could. And what I was going to say is, and I love when somebody can share their prompt, and I know that it's going to get me closer to more usable information that I can then apply and customize for myself. So excellent advice there. And for anyone who's listening to this now or listening to it later, What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the link to that playbook. You want to check out the playbook, I'll put it in the show notes from the edited version of the show. And then you'll be able to download that there and go check it out. One thing you said earlier, Audrey, was about you talked about you can't wait necessarily for the peer-reviewed everything to come out when there's something advancing so quickly, right? In the case of AI, we can't wait until the end of the day. It's not like it's going to just stop and say, okay, now catch up. Let's wait for all the peer-reviewed research to be done. We have to be sort of developing, as they say, while the plane's in the air, we have to be building the plane, right? So my point to that is this quantifying success. How can we look at, and this is forever the thing that I know my friends in association land are looking for. I know like any professional, really, anyone in higher ed, you're looking for, how can I quantify that this is something that's successful? So what are we looking at? What are some measures of success that we might be able to point to say, oh yeah, here's where it's working. Here's where we know that either the efficiency or the new ideas and innovation that's a result of it, the new products, et cetera, can come into play.
Is that for anybody?
That is for anyone
Yes.
who feels inspired.
Yeah. No, I have an idea too. No, you go, Charles.
Yeah, sorry.
I love it. I love good answers.
Well, I'll just say that I think that there's probably two different types of metrics, right? And I'm sure that this ports over into other sectors. For higher ed, there's like your student success metrics, and then there's like the operational metrics that you use to get that done, right? And so, when we look at things like, are we increasing our graduation rates? Are we increasing retention? There's usually going to be leading indicators of that, like how many students are on education plans, and can we track that like week to week? Because we know that the proof's out there that semester by semester education plans and actually register towards them end up graduating at a higher rate. I'm sure there's like analogous outcomes metrics versus process metrics for all types of sectors on this call. And so I think that you probably get pretty deep into some weedy AI metrics, right? So it's like, what percent of students are on education plans? You go one layer down. To what extent were they created by this technology or that technology, and tracking that like day to week? I think that we're very nascent here, so we haven't like made that full metrics tree as a sector yet. Or at least I haven't seen it, because we need to like start getting more of these use cases. I would also say that, and again, I don't know how this ports outside of higher ed, and I'm curious if Audrey and President Baston agree with this, but I think that we can also like fetishize the causation versus correlation thing a little too much, because in higher ed, I think about the things that, Tri-C is doing in other colleges, where you're doing a lot of things at once, and you're not waiting to say, oh, it was the ed plans. Oh, it was making sure every student saw an advisor. And I think AI is just going to be in that mix in that way. And we're never going to be able to, if you make an academic scholarly article about it, that would be helpful for the field if somebody wants to do a randomized control trial. But the problem is, if it's a common sense implementation solution, then you hate to have somebody be the control group. So I hope that makes sense. It wasn't too like nerdy.
I don't think it was too much.
No, I agree with you, Charles. I think that it's just like all of these other interventions that we talk about. It's really difficult to isolate the effects of one specific thing if you have people who are benefiting, hopefully benefiting from many. So I think that that's a fair assertion to make. One other piece that I want to share is around more of like a systems level thinking about knowledge, which maybe sounds really broad and lofty, but I think that one of the things that might be, as a hypothesis, I guess, at the root of some of the kind of panic around AI is that AI is a threat to kind of how we value knowledge, how we think it can be assessed or it should be assessed, how we think it should be measured. And I think that we're going to see a lot of conversation here in the coming months and years ahead, because as the purveyors of knowledge in higher education, I think there's a feeling that kind of we know we're the experts on that, but this is really going to shake up and shift potentially how we view all of that and how we do assess that. And so one leading indicator that I'm looking for and on the equity space on the equity conversation in particular, is for new types of knowledge and voices and perspectives from groups of people who have historically not had their knowledge valued at the same level as past maybe folks who can make it all the way through an academic journey, all the way to that point of peer-reviewed work. I want to see new voices, and I think AI will be working if it's helping bubble up and surface different perspectives that in the past, because of kind of the structure of higher education, those perspectives might have been kept out. So that's more on like a societal systems level, but I think that will be a really great signifier that we're doing something right if we're making new paths for people to contribute to our way of thinking through AI.
And I would just add, from my perspective, it's all about expanding capacity. How does the utilization of AI enable us to expand the kind of capacity so that we can actually get more people getting the help they need when they need it at times that are convenient to them? That's why, from my perspective, it is critical for us to be able to really master prompt generation, so that we actually can get the right quality information, that we can actually use ways to actually streamline processes and actually accelerate the ability for people to navigate complex systems that don't need to be complex. You know, when we think about the bureaucratic structure of higher education, it was supposed to actually not help the student, but actually help the bureaucracy, help the administration of higher education. Well, if we now don't need all of that bureaucracy that supports the actual structures, but not the students, and we actually can utilize some technology that gets at minimizing all of that bloat. Wow, what a wonderful breakthrough opportunity for students to not have to, at 3 o'clock in the morning when they're up and they need somebody, that they actually can go to a knowledge base that can resolve issues without talking to somebody who's going to send them someplace else. And then they play the chutes and ladder game until they drop out of school. So here is an opportunity if we think about it and we utilize it well.
I mean, the people who are listening to this as an audio podcast later, they cannot see me right now, but I'm just like furiously shaking my head, my hands, anything that can move in the camera, just in furious agreement. Because it's so true. Can you imagine not having all of the bureaucracy that's pressing back and making things so difficult? It's hard. It's hard for me to imagine, but you're painting a picture that I really want to see painted. So, let's go there. And actually, to that end, my last question for you as I'm wrapping things up. Which, by the way, this has been a phenomenal conversation today. So thank you so much ahead of time. But where do you see this work that you're doing going? Now, all of you know each other. You're paying attention to what's happening with the development of AI and as it pertains to higher ed. What do you see for the work that you're doing right now to sort of help shape this conversation around AI and higher education as you're moving forward? What is to come? All right. And I see you, Audrey. I'm looking for you.
Sure. There's an interesting popular, maybe they're an association, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, group in higher education, EDUCAUSE. And they released a report yesterday, an AI landscape report, and I was spending some time with it over the past 2 days. And something that I, observed, and being the data person that I am, who loves community colleges, I'm always jumping to the end first if there's a survey and seeing, okay, well, who are they talking about and who was included in this survey and what groups do they represent? And so this is a really interesting report, lots of great insights that I think can relate to lots of industries. A lot of things we covered today: strategic planning for AI, prepare your data for AI, think about ethical and equitable use cases. But what I'm still seeing is, 13% of the participants were from the community college space, and about 21% of the participants were from minority serving institutions, which does not represent parity if you look at the survey population and our larger post-secondary space. And so what I hope will become an emerging trend is that we can push the edges of our data collection, our conversations, our sharing of knowledge and resources, right? Like funding and legal support and technical support to these institutions who right now aren't even participating in surveys and therefore aren't even being considered part of the landscape when they are, because we're not making truly representative statements like most colleges are doing this if we really aren't even including so many community colleges that educate a vast majority of our students in the country that are in the post-secondary space and probably your future workers at all of the associations and the industries you represent. So that's one space where I'd really like us to see the conversation pushed and supported further.
Absolutely. Charles?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Audrey said, I mean, I think it's going to be a matter of more of seeing where the conversation is going, but like more importantly, like moving the conversation. I think it's going to be kind of pointless to speculate as to where it's going to go. You gave the example earlier of social media, and then we repressed that. Somebody put in the chat the item about calculators. Like, we never know these things. Like when email came out in the 90s, it wasn't like, what's going to happen? This. And then it was like even remotely correct like 10 years later. And so I think that's what we're seeing now. So I think like to Audrey's point about like, how are we going to like act right now? I would consider 2 or 3 things, right? Like one is that we've got to like stay vigilantly ahead of where AI is going and not be, doing too much punditry or something. The second thing is like we have to shift, I don't know the best way to put this, but like shift the moral urgency around things like plagiarism to the problems that we need to solve. So instead of moral panics for things like, oh my gosh, is somebody going to write their essay using ChatGPT? How about we have the moral panic about a 1 in 5 graduation rate? How about we have a moral panic about countries leapfrogging us in higher education attainment, of having an innovation gap during climate change and COVID and threats to democracy? We need to be a beacon of the world again. And that's what higher ed was supposed to be in the post-war era. And that's how they talked about it. And I think we need to have that orientation again and bring generative AI in that orientation. And then I guess the last thing is, this is just building off of what President Baston said, but like, I think the lowest hanging fruit is that bureaucracy. It is that bloat. I think that that's even true with just writing, right? I mean, you wouldn't trust AI so much to write you a novel, but in terms of making some anodyne policy that gets the job done, like we find all the ways to make life hard for students. And I'm sure that's true in healthcare for patients and in just pick your sector, pick the association here. And I think you start with the low-hanging fruit on exactly what President Baston said about killing the bloat, killing the bureaucracy. This could really be a bureaucracy killer in the best way possible.
Oh, gosh. Words that speak right to my heart. President Baston.
I would just add that we've got to be careful of false choices. Too often we decide you can either be for it or against it. When the folks that had radios heard about TVs, I'm sure they were like, yeah, that TV thing, it's probably not going to take off. They got TVs and they kept the radios too. So the reality is we have to understand that you can actually keep 2 thoughts in your mind at the same time. You actually can continue to advance and be built on the foundations of really understanding how the world works. It's not either or. And we've got to be able to expand capacity. We've got to be able to give people the resources, particularly under-resourced institutions, the opportunity to engage and to learn and to grow and to get with it. Because if the country is going to move forward, we really don't have any educational institution to leave behind.
Yes. I mean, oh my gosh, this has been such a great show. I like want to end on a high note, and I see this great question actually that comes from Peggy Lamberton. So if you have the time, just to answer one question, folks. This says, Audrey, do you think the pool of knowledge feeding AI is at risk for cyber attack? There might be pollution of online knowledge. Okay, so I get this. This is about talking about, where is the data coming from? Can we trust where it's the pool of knowledge that generative AI is pulling from for the information that's giving us?
Sure. I mean, I think I'll just be transparent. I am no cybersecurity expert, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I think that in any space right now where we have documented information that is feeding into a tool, you said it yourself very well, garbage in, garbage out. That's exactly how I'm thinking about this. And so really important for us to be thinking about the quality of any data that we're using to train these systems, and asking those critical questions as consumers of what data are you using to give me this product or service, and also what data are you collecting from me. So really important question. And I think we might get to a point, you might have noticed on Google now, you search and there's like an AI generated summary before you even get to the results. And for all we know, we're going to end up in a time where AI is training AI is training AI. And so like I still think we're really early in this space, and we need to think about, again, how are we shaping it? And also whose voices, stories, perspectives, knowledge is even included, for better or for worse, looking at the history of kind of many disparate use cases of tech and equity. But there's a lot of information and knowledge to come out here. And I will just say on the equity piece, there's a great book, Unmasking AI, if you're interested in learning more about equity and AI, especially in terms of biometric data. So like facial recognition, things like that. Highly recommend.
And once again, it's also about due diligence. So if we tell our students that AI is like you're an intern or an assistant, you can't turn in to your boss work you didn't check. So it is important for us to make sure that we encourage everyone that is utilizing this information to do the due diligence. You got to check.
Well, I just can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk with us today. Audrey, thank you. I first spoke with Audrey. She was able to bring Charles and bring Michael into this discussion. So I'm very thankful for that. I think it was a really meaningful conversation, and I hope that you all would be open to maybe me reaching out for a follow-up conversation one of these days to find out, as we go along, what's the story now? What's happened since then?
Absolutely. We'll have a lot to share.
Anytime.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for watching today. What did you think? Tell me in the comments, write back to me. Tell me what you thought. What were your takeaways? What were the biggest pieces that stood out to you that said, I never thought about it that way, but now I'm going to do something different because of this? Whether it's something that's going to help you to explore further, ask more questions, I hope that you will stay curious and keep asking questions every day, especially when you're scared. Because as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.